Okay, we're looking good. Hello everyone. Welcome to tonight's online information session. For those who've just joined, this is for the utility rate review. We're ready to get started, and a friendly reminder once again that we are recording the session. So tonight's meeting is taking place on the traditional and unceded territories of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. We extend our appreciation to the Syilx Okanagan people for the opportunity to hold this meeting here today. My name is Andrea Rendell, and I'm the Communications and Engagement Specialist with the city. I have a lot of hosts with us this evening. So tonight with me are Joanne Klebb, Communications and Engagement Manager, Kristen Dixon, General Manager of Infrastructure, and our Interim Chief Administrative Officer. We've got Angela Campbell, Director of Finance and Administration, Drayden Power, Manager of Energy and Environment, and Ehepe Mahmudov, Principal and Consultant with Intergroup Consultants. The purpose of tonight's information session is to ensure that you're aware and understand the recommendations that have come from the utility rate review while providing you with the opportunity to learn more and ask questions. We have a feedback form available on shapeyourcitypenticton.ca that will be open until September 15th if you would like to share your feedback. So how will it work? First of all, I've mentioned a few times, but always a friendly reminder that this session is going to be recorded. And this is just to make sure that we can accurately capture the feedback we receive in the discussion portion. We're going to go over a brief presentation and open the floor to hear your questions at the end. Please use the Q&A to ask questions and to address the group. And please remember to keep questions as concise as possible so that we have the opportunity to get to everybody. And with that, I will hand it over to Kristen for their presentation.
Thank you, Andrea. And just first, I don't see a shared screen. I'm just confirming with the other. Oh, there we go. Okay. And just confirming everyone can hear me okay? Excellent. Okay. Sorry, Andrea, you're going to drive the slides for me, right? There we go. One more, please. So thank you very much. So the city has 4 utilities: electric, treated water, sanitary sewer, and storm sewer, with assets valued at around just over 800 million. The storm sewer is managed like a utility, but it's currently charged on your property taxes. One of the city's main responsibilities is ensuring that residents have dependable and sustainable utilities. Your monthly utility bills provide funding for the operation of each utility, as well as provide capital to maintain or replace infrastructure. This capital is saved over time in reserves, so we have the funds when we need them. Every 4 years or so, the city reviews its utility rates to ensure they are competitive and that they provide the necessary funding to keep our utilities going now and into the future. This year, the city hired Intergroup to conduct this review, and the results will be used to inform the rates over the next 4 years. We also have the representative from Intergroup here tonight to answer any of your detailed questions. The utility rate review has identified a path forward to ensure financial sustainability in a measured way with predictable increases for each utility over the next several years. Before the rates are set, Council wants to ensure you are aware of the findings of this work, what it means to you, and to hear your feedback. This presentation will highlight what you need to know in order to participate. So what did we learn? Over the past few years, electrical utility rates have been reduced or held steady. While this provided relief during the pandemic, it is not sustainable in the long term. At the same time as we kept our increases down, our costs went up, especially for the electric utility. Roughly 80% of our operating costs is the cost of bulk power from FortisBC. FortisBC increased the rates by close to 14% over the past 3 years, and the city did not pass on those increases. It is very similar to using your savings account to pay for your mortgage, which is an ongoing cost, as opposed to your roof replacement, which is a one-time cost. We also know that Fortis is currently seeking an additional 2% retroactive to January 1st, 2023, and we're awaiting the final decision on that. The city is also not immune to the same inflationary cost pressures facing others. We are seeing up to 30 to 50% on fuel and equipment prices, and as high as 50% on, for example, infrastructure renewal, pipe replacement, et cetera. So just as you're going up and filling your car up at the gas station and seeing that prices have significantly changed, those are impacting our budgets as well here at the city. We also learned that currently there's approximately a 12% subsidy to the operating and maintenance costs for the agricultural water utility, and that in all of our utilities, there are some customer classes that do not accurately reflect the cost of providing the service. The report includes 6 key recommendations to ensure the long-term financial sustainability of our utilities. First, it is recommended that we implement rate increases that support the city's asset management investment plans. The review is recommending rate increases that will ensure there's sufficient funding in our reserves when we need it to replace or renew our infrastructure over the long term. This is best practice. This also ensures the customers today are paying for the average life of the assets they are using. Secondly, it's recommended that the rates for each utility customer class, for example, residential, commercial, reflect the cost of service for that sector. And that is one of the fundamental principles of running the utilities. The review recommends adjustments to the various customer classes to ensure each customer class is paying the appropriate amount relative to the cost of that service, and therefore ensuring that one class is not subsidizing the other. This means that some will pay more and some will pay less than the average increases noted in the previous slide. Third, it's recommended that we introduce an inclining rate structure for residential customers with a 3/4 inch meter to encourage conservation. Inclining rate structures are a commonly used tool to encourage conservation. The idea is that customers pay a lower rate for water that is typically consumed as an essential need for things like cooking, cleaning, showering, etc., while water that is used for more discretionary purposes is at a higher rate. The proposed rate structure is only for 3/4 inch residential customers for a couple of reasons. First, it's only proposed for the residential sector as residential customers typically have more control over their consumption. It has only been proposed for the 3/4 inch customers, first, as these represent a large portion of our residential customers, and the larger metered customers often represent multifamily, for example, an apartment. The multifamily adds an aspect of complexity when considering a tiered rate and is something that can be further explored in the future. With an inclining rate structure, high consumers pay more, similar to like an income tax structure. So what we can see on the chart is that the first block of consumption is at one rate, the second block is at a slightly higher rate, and the third rate is, or the third tier is at a higher rate. And again, not all customers will fit into all of these different tiers. Around 50% of customers would only use consumption in the first block, an additional 30% of customers in that second block, and only 20% of our customers would fall in that third tier. Alternatively, the city could choose to continue to charge the same rate for all residential customers. This would mean all residents pay the same variable rate, regardless of whether you have a hot tub or a pool, for example. The fourth recommendation is to increase agricultural water rates to cover 100% maintenance and operations costs. Agricultural water rates are currently subsidized by 12%, as noted earlier, and is recommended that this subsidy be eliminated to cover 100% of the operations and maintenance cost. Capital costs are still subsidized, however. The review did recommend this be studied and reconsidered in the future. The alternative is to continue to subsidize agricultural rates by the 12%. The fifth recommendation is not necessarily financial, but it does recommend that we update our reserve policies to reflect the reserve balances that are needed to support future asset management plans. This updated policy would increase transparency and provide clarity as to why the funds are being collected and saved. We often hear comments related to this question around, why does the city have so much sitting in reserves? And the intent behind this recommendation is to add some clarity as to what those numbers are being used for and being collected for. The sixth recommendation is to formalize the process for calculating the electrical dividend and its utilization into a city policy. It is recommended the city create a policy outlining how the dividend from the electric utility is calculated and used for funding capital projects. The report recommends the dividend be set at 8.5% to 10% of the budgeted electrical utility revenues, which aligns with other utilities. Of note, this funding is then available for capital projects, which would otherwise be required through taxation. So there you have it, the 6 proposed changes that will ensure the long-term financial sustainability of our utilities. If the changes are adopted as recommended, the combined average increase for all of the utilities is just over $20 a month. These rates provide the funding needed to both operate our utilities today as well as replace our assets in the future while keeping our rates competitive. The increase will still be lower than neighboring municipalities when we compare to their rates in 2023, and we expect to be even more competitive relative to those same communities when we compare to their 2024 proposed rates, which are not yet available. So on this slide in particular, I'll just highlight that again, the Penticton recommended rates are the 2024 rates, and we're comparing those on the bar charts to, for example, Vernon, West Kelowna, which is the 2023 rates. And what we're hearing from those other municipalities, similar to the cost pressures that we are facing, is that they're anticipating similar increases to their utilities as well. And I thought I would take a little bit of a deeper dive into the residential electrical rates, because we did hear about that a fair amount at the open house that we held last week. The city is unique in its ownership, only one of 5 in the province of BC in owning an electrical utility. And so we do compare those to these 5 specifically, as well as the FortisBC and BC Hydro comparisons. So it is a little bit different analysis than we typically do in our other financial documents. So what we see here on the residential side is that compared to Fortis, well, Fortis, first of all, is a more appropriate comparison because that is who services the other Okanagan communities. We are outside the BC Hydro service area. And so, for example, Fortis provides service to Kelowna and West Kelowna. And what we can see here is that on average, our residential customers pay less than if they were directly a FortisBC customer, and fairly on par with the other municipal electrical utilities. So next steps. Oh, sorry, Andrea, that's your slide.
That's okay. Just going to say that after feedback closes, staff will present the results of the engagement to council at the regular meeting of October 3. And it's a reminder that community feedback is one of several factors council must balance and consider when making decisions on behalf of the community. And if council supports the recommendations as presented, new rates would be effective beginning January 2024. So let's discuss. If you'd like to ask a question, we see Lori's already pulled the trigger. If you'd like to, please just put it in the Q&A or raise your hand. We can unmute you so you can address the group. And if you can, please remember to keep questions as concise as possible so we have the opportunity to get to everybody. And while you're thinking about your questions, we actually have a few to get you started. So I'm just going to pass it back over to Kristen.
Thank you, Andrea. Sorry, I was following slides out of order. So we thought we would provide some additional information in response to, again, some of the questions that we heard at the open house last week. And so the first one was, how are the funds collected for the electrical utility used? And so there was some confusion around the dividend and the contribution to reserves, et cetera. And so we just created a quick graphic to show how the revenues are broken into those components. So as you can see, just over 80% or so are directly paid to FortisBC, and that is the bulk of our bulk electricity charges that we pay for our consumption. 3.2 million is the portion that pays for our operations and administration related to the utility within Penticton. 3.7 is that dividend payment that I mentioned earlier that is used to fund general capital projects such as repairs to roads or to the pools that would otherwise be funded through property taxes. And 3.9 million is the budgeted transfer to the electrical reserve for those future infrastructure needs that I mentioned earlier based on our asset management plans. So that just gives you a sense of how that breakdown is. And again, when we reference the 35 million relative to those increases that we've seen from Fortis over the last 3 years in particular, and how they're impacting the city's bottom line. Next slide, please, Andrea. The second question we had was, is it actually an advantage for Penticton to own the electric utility? And so in addition to noting that we are in the Fortis service area and our residential rates are lower than the Fortis residential rates, we also have the advantage of owning the electric utility because it keeps the dividends in Penticton. Fortis also collects the dividend, but it's distributed to its shareholders, which are not necessarily obviously residents of Penticton. And so there is that double advantage that we have, and there are others as well, but I just wanted to reaffirm that it is specifically a competitive advantage for Penticton to own the electric utility. A third question is related to the dividend, and some of the questions we had was around, you know, is it misleading because is it another tax that's being hidden elsewhere in the city's budget? And we wanted to provide that information through the report to show that it is quite normal that these other municipalities that operate electric utilities and others that operate electric utilities do also collect a dividend or pay a dividend in one way, shape, or form. The amounts were different for each utility, and so that analysis was done, which was the result of the recommendation that the city charge or collect, the 8.5% to 10% for its dividend. And as I noted earlier, the alternative would be to collect those same funds that are required to fund our capital program through taxations. And so instead of, some people reference it as double dipping, but I would explain it more that it's a split source of funding, partially through the electrical utility and partially through general taxation. Next slide. And we addressed this slightly earlier. Our Penticton electrical rates higher than BC Hydro and other Fortis. Again, we are slightly lower than Fortis when it comes to residential rates, but slightly higher than BC Hydro, but we are outside of the BC Hydro service area. So of course, it's not always easy to compare apples to apples because everybody runs different utilities with different geographical considerations, different infrastructure considerations, different customer makeup. But it does just provide that overview to see how we compare. And I already addressed this. We are not in the BC Hydro service area, so that's not helpful. And this is the other probably most frequent one we heard at the open house, is the confusion around the city's borrowing from the electrical reserve. So the city borrowed around $7.4 million to help fund 3 projects: a portion of the Lake to Lake bike route, a new 2-bay garage at Fire Hall 2, and a portion of the Point intersection. And this decision by funding the project through internal borrowing saved the city about $3 million in interest charges that would have otherwise been required. And these will be repaid before the funds are needed, which is why the city felt that it was in a position to do this internal borrowing. Next slide, please, Andrea. The question that needs to be addressed, though, is that the electrical utility rates are not being increased to repay the loan. The funds will be repaid over 10 years through both gaming revenues from the casino, and the portion related to the Point intersection is being repaid through the Asset Sustainability Reserve. So we're not increasing the electrical utility rates to replace those reserve funds that were temporarily borrowed, and that is a separate issue. And we understand that has caused some confusion related to the utility rate review, but they are not connected. So the utility rates are increasing to fully fund annual operations and maintenance costs, as well as those future infrastructure needs. The other question we hear is, well, there was $20 million in the reserve. That's plenty of money. But the city's utility assets are valued at just over $800 million. And the provincial government requires that cities have sufficient reserves to fund the replacement of these assets. And through the review, the city is recommending setting these minimum reserve balances to ensure transparency of the amounts required. And those amounts required are based on our asset management investment plans that look at that entire life cycle of the utility over 100 years of that infrastructure, and set out how much we need to be investing annually to make sure that we can keep up with the same service levels that we all enjoy today into the future. So with that, that's our predetermined questions, and now I'm happy to switch gears and go into the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Kristen. So with that, we'll open our floor to questions. Lori has a few, so I'm going to go through Lori's first question, then we'll jump to Chandra, who has her hand raised, and then we'll go back into our Q&A. So Lori's first question is wondering if any studies have been done with ideas to create a solar grid with battery storage to feed power to the grid, reducing costs and to provide resiliency if power fails from extreme climate events. I think that's probably a question for Drayden. And then there's a follow-up question that may or may not fall under his hat, which is how is the city educating people not to overuse water and how to properly install xeriscaping and maybe consider that they don't need water hogging lawns.
Perfect. I'll jump in then on that first portion of that question. Thank you, Lori. As you know, this is one of my favorite topics. So hello, everyone. My name is Drayden Power. I'm the manager of energy and environment. Lori's question about solar and battery storage is a great one. We are absolutely looking at doing a project right now, actually, for battery storage specifically, with solar to follow on some new buildings being created here. So just to clarify for everyone's benefit, the reason why battery storage actually reduces our overall costs of power from FortisBC is that when you pay a power bill as a commercial entity, same as in Penticton, you pay for a portion of demand, like how much power you're using instantaneously. and then a portion of energy, which is like consumption. So when you use a battery and you charge it up at night when there's tons of capacity on the grid, even though your consumption is still the same, regardless of when you charge that battery, you can use that battery to offset your demand during normal peak windows, like during dinner time when everyone's cooking dinner, running their laundry, charging their vehicles in the future. That's when we peak, and we'll pay that peak portion to FortisBC. So if we can use a battery to store energy at night, and then during that peak time, offset our own demand from the FortisBC grid, we can reduce our costs. And it's also a very valuable asset when you start thinking of intermittent energy sources such as solar and wind, right? Which only provide power when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. So to really effectively use these resources moving forward, we need to have battery storage available to us, and we're working on projects right away on that. And I won't attempt to answer the xeriscaping question. I'll pass that on to someone else.
I will take a stab at that one. So like anything, when it comes to education-wise, I think we could always do a better job, and certainly that feedback is well taken. I think there are a fair number of resources throughout the Okanagan, but yeah, Penticton, I think on its own could take a more leadership role in encouraging that and educating on that. What I will say is that we have seen efforts, and we have seen the success with those efforts, I would say, because we know that our water demand, our total water consumption over the last, I believe when I last looked, 10 years, fairly consistent over the last 10 years. And so despite growing at the rates that we have over the last few years, we aren't seeing that total consumption and that total demand from our water treatment plant going up. So I think we are making good progress despite being a growing community. We have seen that consumption level off, so that's a sign we're in the right direction. But I think certainly there's lots of education that can be used in addition, but when people start paying and feeling like they're in control of that, that is one of the areas that we're hoping to see. Does this rate structure help us make that shift even more?
Thank you. Chandra, I'm just going to, should be able to speak to us now.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate the presentation, and I also appreciate the explanations. It's certainly, I really enjoy hearing somebody else tell me about it rather than trying to read it. So thank you for providing this opportunity. I had questions about the recommendations that were put forward, and I don't know whether this is just the format that they're supposed to do it in, but what I notice is it's either increase or keep the same, and it's like an either or situation. And I'm wondering, are there not other options, like we have to increase it or we don't increase it? When I see other jurisdictions doing things related to like water use and electrical use, where they have rates that come in depending on the time of day when you're using it. So I guess my understanding is it's the overall increase of rates, or we don't increase our overall use of rates, but can we stepwise it instead? And that's one question I had. And then the other question I had to do with like just over $21 doesn't seem like a lot per month, but for lower income families, it can be, quite a draw on their resources. So I'm wondering what the city has put in place to accommodate people who may not necessarily be able to take on that extra, the extra. I'm done with questions now.
Sure, Drayden, why don't you touch on the time of use piece?
Sure. So yeah, Chandra had a great question about time of use billing, which is a common mechanism you'll see in electric systems these days, especially as people start to adopt electric vehicles. You'll notice that some loads, such as electric vehicles, are fine to be done in the middle of the night, whereas some loads, turning your oven on, running laundry, you're typically going to be doing those when you need them to. The challenge with time of use billing is that it creates an artificial peak whenever you start that time of use. This has been proven through many different situations. But for example, let's say time of use, cheap rates for electricity started at 9 p.m. Right now, the electric grid has a peak around 6 p.m., around dinner time, maybe a bit earlier here in Penticton. And if you create the time of use billing to start at 9 p.m., what you'll get is a mini double peak. So you'll peak a little bit at your dinner time because people are going to cook dinner when they need it. And then you'll see a bigger peak at 9 p.m. when everyone programs their vehicles to turn on, everyone, any programmable load. So vehicles, laundry, dishwashers, all of that'll kind of go on at 9 p.m. What we're looking at, what we're trying to do in the future is a bit more hands-on approach. And when you think of electric vehicles, for example, what's the idea of time of use is to eventually get to a flatline electric grid, right? And so that you have, no peak, because as we said earlier, you pay on your peak to FortisBC, right, our upstream provider. And so what we would like to get to is a completely flat line. And there's different technologies out there that allow us to do this, like a managed charging program directly communicating with your electric vehicle or with your customer to let them know, hey, for you, we need you to charge in between 9 p.m. and 11 p.m. tonight. But your neighbor, we'd like them to charge in between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. And you kind of are able to stagger more load like that, gives you more control, and ultimately achieves the goal of what you're trying to do with your utility. So while time of use is a good first step towards reducing your peak, there's other better options out there that we're exploring that'll allow us to have more control over the grid and give us the same effect. Of course, if you're giving us the ability to manipulate your load, the expectation would be there'd be some kind of compensation in there, similar to a reduced rate through time of use. So these are all mechanisms being explored right now.
Okay. So I guess I'm glad that you talked about that, because I didn't know that about the double peaking, but I don't think that addresses my question. My question has to do with the report, and the report says we either do this or we do this, but there's nothing in between. We either increase the rates or we don't increase the rates. But I guess what I'm trying to point out is, like, maybe there's other options in there, but definitely it sounds like the time of use is not the best option, and you're working on it.
I think, Chandra, to that point, what I could say is that the report doesn't elaborate beyond that, because that wasn't within the scope of what we asked Intergroup to do. We asked them to look at our forecasted operations and maintenance costs and our forecasted infrastructure costs based on our asset management plan and make recommendations. And so those recommendations are fairly limited to that scope of work. What I would say is, of course, if the conversation is that there is interest in reducing service levels or providing different services, that obviously is a different scope of work, and that wasn't explored as part of this rate analysis. So the assumption going into this was providing the same level of service as we do today, and so a reduction in service wasn't considered.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks everybody. Lori's got a few questions in the Q&A, so I'm just going to jump down
just to pause there, Andrea. I think Chandra had that second question about what opportunities there are to assist lower income customers, and I'm not sure if that's an Angela question or a Kristen question.
Did you want me to take that one, Kristen? Yes, please, Anne. So, Chandra, this is something that the utility clerks at the city deal with all the time. There's lots of people throughout the community that may struggle time to time with their bills. The utility clerks have a number of resources that they can direct people to. So what I would suggest is, if there is anyone that if these increases go through that is having trouble with their bills or needs assistance, they can contact the city through those utility clerks, and they'll be provided with resources on who to contact and how they can be helped.
Unmuted. And are those like provincial kind of programs, that kind of thing?
Some of them would be, for sure, yes, Chandra.
Okay. And I guess I'm curious how people find out about that, other than me going around telling people. But I guess I was not aware of that, and so it surprises me, and I'm curious if other people are aware of that.
I don't think it's an uncommon question that they get through the collections department. Anyone that is having trouble paying their bills usually reaches out to the utility department to get extensions or work on how they're going to make those payments. So if you are getting those questions, that is typically what we would say to people. But typically speaking, if someone wants help, they do know to ask us for it.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. So like I said, I'm just going to jump down to Bruce, and then we'll circle back to Lori. And I think this question is probably again for Angela. He's just wondering if he heard correctly that the city is implementing an immediate increase in rates up 5%, and will all increases take place in January?
Sure. So at the last presentation to council, there was direction from council to staff to bring back a temporary or a phased in increase of 5%. That will be coming back to council because we have to amend the fees and charges bylaw to do so. So council will be considering the 5% increase at the next meeting. And if they were to put that forward, it would be adopted at the meeting after that, which I believe is October 17th. And then the rate increases for that would take place probably in November, possibly even December. Any further increases council decides from this process would be implemented for January.
And I apologize, Bruce, I meant to include that in my presentation. So thank you for asking that question.
Excellent. Okay. So Laurie's question is, it's kind of multi-pronged here. So the first part is, how does the city figure out the rate or usage for inclining water rates? We'll maybe pass that to Kristen.
Sure, and I might actually even ask Hayat Bey to jump in on this one, but it is quite a bit of a, I'll call it an art and a science. On one hand, you have to have enough of a difference between the different blocks, the different inclining rates to incentivize the behavior. If the blocks are too small, then it doesn't accomplish that. If the blocks are too large and there's really significant conservation right off the bat, you may not hit the necessary revenue. So it's a combination between wanting people to conserve, but also trying to forecast how much they're going to conserve to make sure that we can still cover the cost of the utilities. So what they did is they looked at where these inclining rate structures had existed previously, what their success had been with them, and then applied that to come up with a recommendation, as I said, around how many customers you want in each of those classes, and looking more specifically at our water consumption patterns here in Penticton and applying those assumptions. So I do think this is something that if we in fact introduce this the first time around, it is something that we'll likely be tweaking over subsequent years to find the right calculation for Penticton to get that desired behavior. And Hayat Bey, I'm not sure if you want to add anything else to that explanation.
Yeah, thank you. I think you covered it quite accurately, Kristen. So yeah, and for that purpose, though, like we did go through basically the billing data and analyzed, the data down to figure out how much of the consumption happens, in the majority of how much of the consumption is covered by the majority of customers, basically, and then what's the incremental on it, and then what's really, the outlier, so to say. So that's how we got to covering 80% of customers within the first consumption, and that also includes like any type of customer, because any customer who consumes water, the first part of their consumption will be under the first block, so they will get the benefit of paying a lower rate. And then, as their consumption increases, just like as your tax brackets go, so for that incremental portion only, they will pay a higher rate. So it's not that, some specific customers are, being unfairly treated. So everyone gets that same treatment, basically.
Great, thank you. Laurie's also expressed concerns about how agricultural producers could survive rate increases, and then is wondering what's included in storm drain costs.
So on the second one, certainly, as with all of our customer classes, we are reaching out to the agricultural customers as well. So we are seeking that feedback directly from them and expect to hear that as well, Laurie. And thirdly, what is included in the storm drain costs? There are costs to operate and maintain our storm system, but it also includes forecasted costs to help with our creek naturalization projects that we have planned for both Penticton Creek and Ellis Creek, and our storm master plan infrastructure plan that we have for the next while as well. So there's a fairly significant amount of projects in that as well, but it does include the creeks, which is a fairly large portion as well.
Thanks, Kristen. Laurie shared a few more sentiments I'll circle back to. I'm just going to jump down to Nicole's question. In regards to residential gardens for food growing purposes, would the water tax impact these individuals and families by charging them for watering their garden? Emphasis being on food growing as an essential need and having the increased rate regardless. Maybe that's a Kristen question.
What I can say to that is that there's no differentiation in customers for the residential 3/4 inch customers and how they're using that water. So certainly if someone is choosing to use that water for food growing purposes as opposed to any other purpose, they would fall under that same proposed rate structure. Again, we just don't have the differentiation at that customer class level to differentiate between customers who are using it for that purpose as opposed to some other purpose.
Okay, thanks. Next question is from Lynn. 2 parts. Are any infrastructure projects, particularly for water, responsible for reserve increases? For example, the dam is due for an upgrade. I'll leave that with Kristen, and then I'll dive into the second part.
Yeah, and what I would say for that answer is that yes, certainly many of our infrastructure projects, all of the projects identified in our water master plan and our asset management plans are a portion of what is driving the increases. As I said, the increases are being driven by both the increase in costs we're experiencing on the operations and maintenance side, but also on that infrastructure side. So certainly those are both driving it.
Okay, thanks. And the second part to your question is just wondering if expenses for infrastructure are carried by public ownership. They're just looking to be reassured that no private-public partnerships are being considered. Not sure if that's...
There are no proposals that I'm currently aware of that are related to our infrastructure public ownership.
Excellent, thank you. And then just circling back to some of Lori's sentiments, advantage of owning our utility is creating power for us to use and hopefully pay less to Fortis. And internal borrowing is a good idea and should be supported. We have a new question from Gail. Where does one find the storm drain master plan?
Thank you for that. On our infrastructure master plan, and Joanne, I'm going to look to you. I believe all the master plans are listed there, and we can certainly provide the link. I think the link might actually already be on the Shape Your City website.
Yeah, I can definitely find it on the website and post it in the chat.
And Joanne, does that include, do we have the links to the Penticton Creek master plan and the Ellis Creek master plan as well?
Yeah, I believe we have a master plan page on the website, and that's where you can find all of the major planning documents. So I'll put that whole page there as well.
Thank you.
Great. That's all we have in the Q&A right now. So if anyone has any questions that we haven't touched on yet, or if you need anything recapped, just let us know. You can put up your hand, we can unmute you, or throw your question in the chat.
I'll have to send that link out after our session, I think. We don't have any more questions coming in. I think that's all she wrote, Andrea.
Well, that's great. I'm glad we could answer all the questions. That's a short meeting. If there aren't any more questions from folks, if you do have more questions, though, you can always send them to getconnected@penticton.ca. If something wakes you up in the middle of the night that you forgot to ask, feel free. Here's a good question from Nicole. Just wants to know, why are we holding these meetings at dinner time?
Well, I can jump on that one. Yeah, it's very tricky. We've tried any number of scenarios, and the 6 to 7:30 seems to be the best option. And so, people will often eat their dinner while listening in on the presentation. So yeah, we try to provide a few different options for people to participate so that we can kind of try and accommodate people's preferences. So thanks for that. If you have another suggestion, we're always open to trying new things.
Awesome. Bruce has just said thanks for the explanations, and we have an anonymous question. Redlands is currently receiving some new infrastructure. Are there any costs to those homeowners? Could that be a Kristen question?
Yeah, so the work that's happening in the Redlands is part of our normal neighborhood rehabilitation program, and so that is covered by the funds that we collect for utility rates. So they would not pay anything extra for that work, just as occurs elsewhere in the community.
Sometimes when we go into various neighborhoods, we do offer the opportunity for residents to do additional upgrades at their cost. So that does happen from time to time, whether people want to take advantage of upgrading their water service or perhaps even upgrading their electrical service, things like that, while we're in there doing rehabilitation. So for the standard city public infrastructure, no, there's no direct charge. That is covered through your general utility rates.
Excellent. Any other takers out there? We've got some time if you have questions, so feel free. Nicole's wondering if we have any subsidies in place for xeriscaping.
We do not provide any funding for people who choose to implement xeriscaping. And I'm sensing a trend, Nicole, but yeah, we don't currently have any grant funding programs or anything like that. So that would be solely at the homeowner's discretion.
Okay, and for anyone who's curious, Joanna's provided the links in the chat to the master plan page that has all of our management plans there. So stormwater and other infrastructure plans are there, and creek management plans are also in there. So you can fill your boots on that webpage if you like. Yeah, no more questions coming in through the Q&A. Not seeing any more hands. We'll just give folks another minute or two if they have any burning questions they'd like to have answered this evening. Here we go, from a question from John. We live in a gated strata community, and they're curious who they inquire about wrapping the small pad mount transformers in their community. That's a fun project.
I'll go ahead and answer that one. That's a very timely question there, John. We're actually just about to release our wrapping policy, which gives customers such as yourself opportunities to be able to wrap our pad mounted assets. So if you email our electric utility email address, which I'll put into the chat here shortly, I'll get Joanne to put into the chat, and you just enter your address and the asset tag, if you have it ideally, of the transformer outside, we'll be able to take a look at that and help you through it.
Excellent. Those are always fun projects. Just an anonymous question, almost comment, but I think we could look into it. When they did upgrades on their home, they were charged to put in the water line upgrade, but they're just curious why that wouldn't be covered under new infrastructure upgrades.
So how it works is if there are upgrades that are either required for a development or triggered by a development, then those upgrades are usually borne by the developer or the person doing the upgrades to the home that requires the infrastructure. The challenge with the city contributing to that is that it would be very difficult for us to meet the demand across the entire city for all of those infrastructure upgrades. So sometimes it is just a bit of luck in terms of where the rehabilitation occurs and the opportunity to upgrade as part of a city project, as opposed to going in and doing your own project and then having to pay for those infrastructure upgrades as part of the project. We are looking at, through our OCP task force, ways to try and lessen that burden. So where do we have infrastructure that can service more homes, more growth and development at lower cost? Because we certainly recognize that some of those infrastructure upgrades can be fairly costly to people who are looking to develop or do something with their home. So it is a challenge, we understand that, but it typically has been, and as is in most cities, where if you are triggering an upgrade or doing it in advance of when the city is able to upgrade that infrastructure, it is at the cost of the developer. And there are other tools around latecomers and whatnot to help try and recover some of those costs if they do benefit other residents or other properties, but it is definitely a challenge.
Thanks, Kristen. I think this next one is for you as well. Laura's just curious why we aren't on stricter water restrictions.
So we have, thanks for that, Lori. We've been monitoring the provincial drought conditions very closely, as well as participating in regular meetings with our Okanagan partners and other municipalities. And it has been a really difficult conversation to have around the increasing levels of drought in the community, or in the Okanagan and in the province, quite frankly, relative to the storage of water that we have. And the difficult decision that we have is that under our stage 1 restrictions, we still have our consumption spread out quite a bit. What we find when we move to those next stages is that we actually increase our peak consumption because people are watering on less numbers of days. And so it's actually harder on our water treatment plant through our peak times through July and August, for example, when we increase those peaks on those restricted watering days. And so we were carefully monitoring our storage. If we became concerned about the storage that we had in our reservoirs and the lake level, we certainly would have increased those restrictions, but we did not see that happen. And we have seen that happen in past years, but we did not see it this year. And so we recognize it was a bit of a miss. It was difficult to message that we were in a very complicated drought situation, but we did have ample water in our storage and our reservoirs. And so we were closely monitoring that, and we just felt it was best for the system to not increase those restrictions.
Thanks, Kristen. Lori's got a few more questions, so I'm just going to jump down to Gail, who says thanks for the links. And they're just wondering who they can ask location-specific questions regarding future plans and how projects are prioritized. Is it helpful to lobby City Hall regarding specific location needs?
I would suggest you direct those inquiries to engineering@penticton.ca, and they can certainly help you understand where you might fit in terms of your area, if it is already in the storm master plan, and how those priorities were assigned. And that would be your best starting point, is to have those conversations with our engineering staff.
Awesome, thank you. Lori has a few more conservation items there. So just noting that reducing water can help make people aware of drought concerns now and in the future, educating about reducing water use, and just wondering how the city works to educate residents on water use, and are there opportunities to change bylaws to encourage proper xeriscaping?
I think, Lori, to some of those questions, it's again something we can always do better at. We are always kind of cautious, I would say, around the consequences of some of the xeriscaping messaging around heat, island effects, and things like that. When we see, whole front yards that just become rock, that is also challenging too. So I think, yes, there is certainly more to be done there, and there's always more that we can do. And I would just say that thank you for that feedback, and it's something we can add to our list of future goals. It's as you know, there's carrots and there's sticks, and we have tried a fair amount of carrots, I would say, in the past, and certainly there's a little bit of encouragement through our current variable rates and the fact that we even have water meters. Many communities still don't even have water meters, and we believe that this inclining rate structure is kind of the next step to financially encourage that, but it doesn't mean we can't do more on the education and incentive side.
Excellent. Okay. I think we've covered everything that was in our Q&A. If anyone has any hands and would like to address the group, they're more than welcome to. Great. Not seeing any other hands or anything else coming in through the chat. So if everyone is comfortable with that, I guess we can give you back the rest of your evenings. Excellent. Okay, well, then I will just mention before everyone heads off that we'd like to say thanks again for attending the presentation, and we hope it helped everyone understand some of the recommendations that are coming forward. If you haven't done so already, please complete the feedback form before it closes on September 15th. All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.